When did technology peak? I think most everyday technology has evolved so much that it has made everything much worse, and that the technology we have today is worse than the technology we had in the past. The technology we have now fills every gap, every moment of silence where an original thought might occur, and every second where you might have otherwise just existed without stimulation. Because if you really think about it, there used to be a natural limit to how much technology you could consume in a day, and that limit wasn't something you had to enforce, it was just built into the way things worked, like you could go on your computer, browse a few websites, maybe watch some videos or play a game, and then eventually you'd hit a point where you'd kind of exhausted what was available to you, or at least what felt interesting, and you'd lean back in your chair and just feel done with it, not in a negative way, just in a way that made you go do something else, maybe go outside, maybe call a friend, maybe just sit there and let your mind wander for a bit, or play an instrument, or even start a YouTube channel. That moment of being done is something that feels almost impossible now because there is no end anymore. There's always something else waiting, something perfectly lined up for you, something that knows exactly what will keep you there just a little bit longer. I don't think people really expected that shift of technology becoming an eternity of everything you could ever wish for to happen when the internet was first becoming a thing, back when it was more of a curiosity than a necessity. Like the fact that people used cash for everything, which doesn't sound like a big deal at first, but it meant that everyone was carrying around something physical, something they could give, something they could lose, something they could hand to another person without thinking too much about it. A businessman could be walking past someone on the street and reach into his pocket and find a few coins he didn't really need. And without overthinking it, he could just give them away. And that moment would mean something to both people in completely different ways. One person gets a bit of help, the other gets a small sense of having done something good, and neither of them had to open an app or scan a code or wonder if they had the right payment method, it just happened. And I'm not saying digital payments are bad, they're obviously more efficient and more secure and more convenient in a lot of ways, but they remove that kind of spontaneous human overlap, and when you remove enough of those small overlaps, life starts to feel more separated even if it's more connected on paper. If you want to buy something now, you can even just use self-checkout. And I guess that will be its own video, because if I had to share my thoughts on self-checkout in this one, it would be 3 hours long. But back to the point, we just walk in each other's proximity and make beeping noises and the payment is done. The same kind of thing shows up in how we communicate now, because technically we are more connected than ever. You can talk to anyone instantly, no matter where they are, you can send a message, make a call, FaceTime, and it all happens in seconds, and that's incredible. There's no denying that, but at the same time it changes the emotional structure of relationships in a way that's hard to describe, because when communication is constant and takes no effort, it loses some of the weight it used to have. Not because the people matter less, but because the distance between you and them doesn't exist in the same way anymore. And distance used to play a role in how we valued time together. If someone lived far away, seeing them again was something you looked forward to, something you planned for, something that carried a bit of emotional build-up, and when it finally happened, it felt meaningful in a way that's hard to replicate through a screen. And now that we can maintain a kind of constant low-level connection with almost anyone, it's like we've replaced that presence with availability. And those two things aren't exactly the same, even if they look similar. And then there's the way we entertain ourselves, which might be the clearest example of all of this, because entertainment used to have limits too. And those limits forced you to engage with it differently. If you think about older games like Skate 3 or Call of Duty Black Ops 2, and even if these games didn't come out in the period that I think technology peaked, they still work as an analogy for what I am trying to say here. Those games didn't give you everything up front, they didn't guide you through every possible way to play, and because of that, people had to come up with their own ways to have fun. Like creating custom game modes, setting weird challenges, messing around with friends in ways that the game didn't explicitly design for. Now, if you look at a lot of modern games, they're objectively better in terms of graphics and mechanics and content. There's more to do, more to unlock, and yet a lot of people feel less engaged, or at least differently engaged, because everything is already there. And when you remove the need for the player to create their own fun, you also remove a layer of personal involvement. And that same pattern shows up outside of games too, because when every interest you have is immediately satisfied by an endless stream of content, you don't have to go searching for anything. You don't have to sit with the discomfort of not knowing what to do next. And that discomfort, as annoying as it is, used to be where a lot of creativity came from. Games are so good nowadays that they all just suck. This comparison might be too extreme, but it's kind of like being hooked up in the Matrix and just getting fed experiences rather than actually thinking or doing anything you actually want to do. I think that's why boredom matters more than we give it credit for, because it's not just an empty state, it's a kind of pressure that pushes you to do something. And when you eliminate boredom entirely by filling every possible gap with content, you also eliminate that pressure and life becomes smoother and easier in a lot of ways, but somehow makes itself even more boring. At some point, and I don't think there's a single exact moment where this happened, but somewhere along the way, probably around the late 2010s, everything became designed to keep you engaged indefinitely. Not just entertained for a while, but held in place for as long as possible. And that's where things start to feel different, because it's no longer about giving you something useful or enjoyable and then letting you move on. It's about removing the moment where you would naturally stop. And once that moment is gone, you have to create it yourself, which is a lot harder than it sounds when everything around you is designed to make you stay. And this is where I start to feel like maybe there was a kind of peak, not in terms of raw capability, but in terms of balance, a period where technology was advanced enough to genuinely improve life, but not so advanced that it replaced parts of it. And if I had to put that period into words, even though it's a bit of a simplification because there were obviously huge differences within it, I'd probably say somewhere between 1995 and 2010, not because those 15 years were perfectly identical, but because they share this underlying quality where technology was present and useful and even very exciting. But it didn't contaminate everything yet. It didn't fill every corner of your attention. During that time, people still had to step away from their devices because there wasn't enough on them to stay forever. And that sounds like a limitation, but it also created space, and in that space, people did other things. They met up in person more often, they got bored and had to figure out what to do. They used technology as a tool rather than a default state, and that doesn't mean everything was better. There were plenty of downsides and things we've clearly improved since then, but there was a kind of balance that feels almost impossible to find now. Going on the computer used to be like going to the gym. It even felt like its own place, and unless you were specifically interested, you couldn't really spend more than an hour or two a day on it. And I don't want to romanticize it too much because it wasn't perfect, and there are things about modern technology that I wouldn't want to lose, like the ability to learn almost anything instantly, or to connect with people across the world, or to create and share things in ways that weren't possible before. Those are real advantages and they matter, but at the same time it feels like we gained those advantages in a way that also introduced new problems, and those problems are subtle enough that we don't always notice them. Because they don't feel like problems in the traditional sense, they feel like habits, like normal behavior. Just because Google Maps is available, why can we no longer use a map to navigate? Just because we can listen to music all the time, why do we need to? We survived completely fine without those things before, but why can't we do that anymore just because we have an alternative? It seems like some people can't even think about stuff anymore just because now they have the ability to ask AI. Spending hours on your phone doesn't feel like something is wrong, it just feels like what you do, and maybe that's the biggest shift of all, that the line between using technology and being absorbed by it has become harder to see, and when that line disappears, it's difficult to know if things are actually better. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if everything just paused, just enough to remind us what it feels like to reach the end of something, to run out of content, to be in a moment where there's nothing left to scroll and nothing left to watch and nothing left to click on, and you have to decide what to do next without being guided by an algorithm. It's possible that every generation thinks the version of the world they grew up closest to was the right one, and maybe this is just another version of that. But even with that in mind, it still feels like there's something different about this particular shift. Because it's not just about preference, it's about how deeply technology has integrated into every part of life, and once something reaches that level, it stops being easy to evaluate from the outside. The peak of technology has to be when we got the most possible benefits from it without the consequences that I feel like current technology is having. There doesn't seem to be a separation between technology and real life anymore, and that is obviously a good thing if you need a prosthetic limb, but it is an absolute nightmare for everyday life where you want to make friends, talk to strangers, do something silly, cry, try something new, or just dance at a concert. Yes, I do think that bad concert crowds are mostly technology's fault, but I will make another video about that soon. Most people won't pick up an instrument, they won't ask out that girl they like, they won't go skateboarding, but they will wonder what to do next even though there's already too much to choose from. And I probably will too.